On our anniversary night, my father-in-law kept insulting me, but when I finally spoke back, my husband slapped me hard across the face in front of 600 guests. Everyone laughed at me. I wiped my tears, walked away, and made one single phone call. Dad, please come. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Naomi, and I am 33 years old. For the past decade, I have worked as a historic real estate consultant. It is a quiet profession, requiring patience and deep respect for the past. I prefer simple clothes and quiet living. My husband is the exact opposite. He is 35 years old and the vice president at his father's wealth management firm. Preston lives for the spotlight. He thrives on tailored suits, luxury cars, and the constant validation of his peers. Tonight was the absolute pinnacle of his social calendar we were attending, the 10th anniversary gala for his father's investment fund at the most exclusive country club in our state. The grand ballroom was a sea of crystal chandeliers and towering floral arrangements. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of champagne. 600 of the most influential people in the city were in attendance, including politicians, corporate titans, and local celebrities. I stood near the main dining table, nursing a glass of sparkling water. I was wearing a simple, elegant navy blue gown that I bought off the rack. I felt perfectly fine until I looked at my in-laws. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, held court near the center of the room. She wore a custom designer dress costing more than my first car, and her neck was heavy with diamonds. Next to her stood my sister-in-law Camille, wearing an ostentatious display of jewels. Camille was accompanied by her husband DeAndre. DeAndre is an African-American corporate lawyer who handles the legal maneuvering for my father-in-law's firm. He stood there nursing a glass of expensive bourbon, calculating every social interaction. I tried to remain invisible, hoping the night would pass without incident, but in this family, my mere existence was considered an offensive disruption. My father-in-law, Richard, stepped up to the main podium. The string quartet stopped playing, and a hush fell over the massive ballroom. Richard tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon, commanding the attention of all 600 guests. He looked out over the crowd, his chest puffed with pride. Thank you all for gathering here to celebrate a decade of unprecedented growth and prosperity. He began, his voice echoing through the sound system. We built this firm on the foundation of excellence. In our world, success is not a coincidence. It is the result of breeding discipline and an unwavering commitment to our legacy. Our family understands the value of a superior bloodline. We do not just manage wealth, we preserve a standard of greatness that separates the exceptional from the ordinary. The crowd murmured in polite agreement. I kept my eyes focused on my water glass, praying he would move on to thanking his employees. Instead, Richard turned his gaze directly toward our table. His eyes locked onto me, and a cruel, calculated smile spread across his face. Of course, maintaining this legacy requires a certain level of magnanimity. He continued, his voice taking on a mocking, theatrical tone. We must always remember to give back to those less fortunate. My son Preston has always taken our philanthropic mission to heart. In fact, his dedication to charity is so profound that he brought it right into our own home. A few people in the crowd chuckled uncertainly, not quite understanding where he was going with this. Richard raised his glass higher, gesturing directly at me. 10 years ago, Preston could have chosen a partner from any of the prominent families in this room, but instead, he chose to elevate a woman from absolute zero, a woman who spends her days digging through the dirt of old houses pretending to be a professional. He gave her a name, a lifestyle, and a place at this table. It takes a truly generous man to overlook such a stark lack of pedigree and try to polish a stone, hoping it might shine like a diamond. So let us raise a glass to Preston and his relentless commitment to charity. The words hung in the air, dripping with venom. I stood frozen, my face burning with a humiliation so profound it felt like a physical weight crushing my chest. I looked around the ballroom, hoping someone, anyone, would realize how incredibly inappropriate and cruel this was. But I did not find any sympathy. Instead, the ballroom erupted in laughter. 600 elite guests, the supposed cream of society, were laughing at me. I looked at Beatrice, and she was openly smirking, hiding her amusement behind a crystal goblet. Camille giggled loudly, leaning into DeAndre, who simply shook his head and took another slow sip of his drink, his face completely devoid of empathy. My last hope was Preston. I turned to my husband, the man who had promised to love and protect me. I waited for him to step forward to take the microphone to defend his wife and demand respect. I waited for him to prove that our 10-year marriage meant more to him than his father's toxic approval. But Preston did not look angry. He did not look defensive. He looked at his father, then looked at the laughing crowd and smiled. Preston raised his glass high in the air, turned toward Richard and clinked his glass in absolute agreement. In that truly sickening moment, I realized that I was entirely alone, and my husband was my absolute greatest enemy. The applause and laughter continued to echo against the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. I stood perfectly still. Once I might have cried. But tonight the absolute betrayal in Preston's eyes changed something fundamental inside my chest. The warmth of a decade of marriage instantly evaporated, leaving only cold, hard clarity. I looked at my husband smiling alongside his father, and I felt absolutely nothing for him. To my left, a small jazz band had set up a microphone on a sleek silver stand. I did not run. I did not cry. I walked with slow, deliberate steps toward that microphone. My navy blue gown brushed against the polished marble floor. Guests watched, expecting an embarrassed exit. Beatrice nudged Camille, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. They were waiting for my complete humiliation to conclude. I reached the silver stand and gripped the microphone. The cold metal grounded me. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp thud echoed over the sound system, instantly cutting through the symphony of elitist laughter. 600 faces turned back toward me. Richard frowned, annoyed by the interruption. Preston lowered his champagne flute, his brow furrowing in confusion. I took a deep breath. My voice projected clear and unwavering across the massive ballroom. "Thank you, Richard, for that incredibly illuminating toast," I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite and measured. "It is true that my background is different from yours. I spend my days evaluating old structures, identifying rot in the foundations, and saving things that are on the verge of total collapse." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. The crowd remained silent, unsure of my intent. I looked directly at my father-in-law. Richard's arrogant smile began to falter. "And speaking of structures on the verge of collapse," I continued, "I think it is only fair to mention exactly how far my charity extends in this family. You see, my little renovation business, as you call it, was actually quite busy last month. In fact, we were so busy that I was able to personally wire $200,000 directly into Preston's primary trading account." A collective gasp rippled through the front tables. I did not break eye contact with Richard. "Yes," I said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear me. $200,000 of my hard-earned dirt-digging money was wired just in time to cover a massive margin call. It seems the superior bloodline was about 48 hours away from defaulting on a highly leveraged commercial real estate position. "So you are absolutely right, Richard. I do fix crumbling foundations. I just saved yours from total bankruptcy." The heavy silence that followed was absolute and truly terrifying. It was a suffocating quiet, where not a single human breath could be heard among the 600 elite guests. Then the whispering began. It started like a low hiss, spreading rapidly from table to table. Investors leaned into each other, exchanging panicked glances. Corporate titans who had trusted Richard with their millions suddenly looked directly at him with intense suspicion and deep fear. Richard stood frozen at the podium. All the color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw hung slightly open, completely stripped of his previous arrogance. Beatrice dropped her crystal goblet. It shattered against the marble floor, but she did not even look down. Her face was twisted in absolute horror as the social standing she worshipped began to disintegrate before her eyes. Camille covered her mouth with both hands, looking frantically between me and her father. But it was DeAndre who truly understood the gravity of my words. The brilliant, ruthless corporate lawyer did not panic like the rest of them. DeAndre narrowed his dark eyes and stared at me with chilling intensity. His legal mind was racing, calculating the damage. He realized in that split second that the quiet, unassuming daughter-in-law possessed intimate knowledge of their deepest financial vulnerabilities. I was not just an embarrassment to them anymore. I was an active, immediate threat to their entire empire. I turned my gaze away from DeAndre and looked at my husband. Preston was shaking. His carefully constructed image of power and superiority was completely shattered. For a man who lived entirely for the validation of the upper class, being exposed as a financial failure, saved by his working-class wife, was the ultimate emasculation. The wealthy peers he desperately wanted to impress were now looking at him with pity and disgust. His face turned a violent shade of red. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. He dropped his glass and let out a primal roar of rage. "You shut your mouth!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure fury. Preston charged across the ballroom floor. Guests scrambled out of his way, pulling their chairs back to avoid his blind rage. I stood my ground, holding the microphone, refusing to show any fear. He closed the distance between us in seconds. I thought he would grab the microphone or yell in my face. I never expected the violence that followed. Preston lunged forward, shifting his weight, and swung his right arm with all his strength. His open palm struck the side of my face with a sickening crack that echoed through the silent ballroom. The force of the blow was staggering. A burst of white light exploded in my vision, and the metallic taste of blood instantly flooded my mouth. The impact lifted my feet off the marble floor. I spun backward, completely out of control. Directly behind me stood a massive 10-tier champagne tower, glowing under the ballroom spotlights. I crashed heavily into the display. Hundreds of crystal glasses shattered in a spectacular explosion of glass and expensive vintage champagne. The sharp shards rained down around me as I collapsed onto the soaking wet marble floor, entirely surrounded by the wreckage of their perfect celebration. The sharp sting of broken crystal sliced through the thin fabric of my gown. Champagne soaked my skin, mixing with the metallic taste of blood pooling in my mouth. I lay there for a fraction of a second, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Not a single person stepped forward. 600 elite guests simply watched me bleed. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, ignoring the sharp glass digging into my palms. My ears rang from the force of the slap, but my vision remained completely clear. I looked toward the front tables. Camille stood there, her hand covering her mouth as a sharp, cruel laugh escaped her lips. She found my physical humiliation genuinely entertaining. Beside her, DeAndre did not smile or flinch. The brilliant corporate lawyer simply raised his glass of bourbon, took a slow, deliberate sip, and watched me with absolute cold detachment. He was already calculating the legal fallout. I forced myself to stand. Champagne dripped from my ruined dress. Pooling on the marble floor, I wiped the blood from my lower lip with the back of my hand. I did not rush. I picked up the microphone from the wreckage. I looked. Preston dead in the eye. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched, still trying to project power, but his eyes betrayed his sheer panic. I dropped the microphone. It hit the marble with a deafening screech of feedback. Then I turned and walked away. I kept my head held high, forcing every single guest to step aside and clear a path for me. The heavy wooden doors of the ballroom swung shut behind me, cutting off the suffocating whispers. The grand corridor of the country club was deserted. I walked past ornate oil paintings and gilded mirrors, leaving a trail of wet footprints and shattered crystal behind me. The physical pain in my cheek was beginning to radiate across my entire face, but I refused to acknowledge it. I pushed open the door to the grand restroom. The space was pristine. Gold fixtures gleamed against white marble counters. Walked straight to the vanity and gripped the edge of the sink. I stared at my reflection. A dark purple bruise was already blossoming across my left cheekbone. My lip was split and swelling rapidly. My carefully styled hair hung in wet, matted strands against my neck. I looked like a victim. But looking at that bruised face, I did not feel like a victim. I felt a terrifying sense of freedom. For 10 years, I had played the role they assigned me. I had been the quiet, unassuming wife who smiled through the insults and swallowed the disrespect. I had hidden my true identity to prove I could be loved for who I was and not for what my family possessed. Tonight, Preston proved that my experiment in living a normal life was a complete failure. He did not love me. He loved the control he thought he had over me. I reached into the small hidden pocket of my ruined gown and pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked from the fall, but it still worked. I opened my contacts. I scrolled past the decorators, the contractors, the historical preservation boards. I scrolled past Preston and Beatrice and Camille. I stopped at a number I had not dialed in a decade, a number belonging to a man whose very name commanded fear and absolute respect in the highest echelons of global finance. My thumb hovered over the screen. Calling this number meant the end of my quiet life. It meant unleashing a force that would completely obliterate the fragile world Preston and his arrogant family had built. It meant returning to the empire I had walked away from. I looked at my bruised face one last time. I pressed the call button and raised the phone to my ear. The line rang only once. It did not go to an assistant. It did not go to a secretary. A deep, commanding voice answered immediately, the voice of a man who controlled billions of dollars and countless lives. He only said one word. Naomi. I closed my eyes. The 10 years of distance vanished in an instant. I did not cry. I did not explain the gala, or the slap, or the humiliation. I only spoke 3 words. Dad, please come. The line went dead. He did not ask questions. He did not need details. Harrison Global operated with swift, devastating efficiency, and my father was the architect of that power. I lowered the phone and set it on the marble counter. I turned on the gold faucet and splashed freezing cold water onto my face. The sting of the cold against my split lip brought me back to the immediate reality of the night. I grabbed a thick white towel and began drying my arms and neck. The soft fabric snagged on a piece of crystal still embedded in my skin. I pulled it out and tossed it into the sink. I was no longer the charity case they brought to their anniversary gala. I was the heir to an empire they could not even begin to comprehend. Suddenly, my cracked phone screen lit up. A sharp buzz echoed against the marble walls of the pristine bathroom. I picked up the device and looked at the notification. It was a text message from Preston. I swiped the screen and read the words he had typed in his blind, arrogant rage. He wrote, "Do not bother coming back to my house. You are getting nothing. DeAndre is already drafting the papers." I read the cruel message twice, making sure I memorized every bitter syllable. He believed he held all the power. I locked the screen and placed the phone inside my ruined pocket. The game was finally changing, and my husband had absolutely no idea what was coming next. I left the country club through the service exit, avoiding the valet staff. My ruined gown clung to my skin, and the cold night air bit into the fresh bruise on my cheek. I hailed a passing taxi, sliding into the back seat, and giving the driver the address of the marital home I had shared with Preston for the past decade. The house was a stunning piece of late 19th century architecture. I had personally spent 3 years restoring its original mahogany trim and repairing the slate roof. The taxi pulled away, leaving me standing on the pristine brick driveway. I walked up the front steps and reached for the electronic keypad. Governing the heavy oak door, I punched in the 6-digit code we used. A harsh red light blinked back at me. Access denied. I tried again, pressing the numbers firmly. The red light flashed a second time, followed by a sharp automated beep. DeAndre moved faster than I anticipated. The ruthless corporate lawyer had likely dispatched an emergency locksmith the moment Preston sent that text message. They wanted to lock me out completely, separating me from my passport, my financial documents, and every personal belonging I owned. They thought they could leave me shivering on the porch like a discarded stray. But they forgot who actually restored this house. I turned away from the front door and walked down the narrow side path, slipping past the manicured hedges and tall iron gates. I made my way toward the rear of the estate where the foundation met the sloping garden. The shadows were deep here, hiding the original stonework. During the foundation repairs, I had insisted on preserving an old coal chute window near the basement utility room. Preston demanded it be sealed with concrete, but I convinced the contractors to install a reinforced latch that could be bypassed. If you knew the exact pressure point to strike, I knelt in the damp soil, ruining my silk gown even further. I reached under the cast iron grate, feeling for the hidden mechanism. My fingers found the cold steel lever. I pressed upward with my thumb and applied my weight against the frame. The old hinges groaned in protest, but gave way. The small window swung inward, revealing the pitch-black basement. I slipped through the narrow opening, dropping quietly onto the concrete floor below. The darkness enveloped me, but I did not need a light. I navigated the basement entirely by memory, weaving past the wine cellar and the climate control units, until I reached the main staircase. I climbed the wooden steps in total silence. My bare feet made no sound against the polished oak floors. The house was completely empty, but it felt entirely alien to me. I marched straight up the grand staircase toward the master bedroom. I only needed my passport, my private hard drive, and a few essential items. Before my father arrived, I pushed open the heavy double doors of the master suite and stepped inside. The soft moonlight filtered through the sheer curtains, illuminating a scene of absolute disrespect. Lined up against the far wall were 6 heavy-duty black trash bags. They were bulging and haphazardly tied. Some of my clothes spilled out of the top of the nearest bag. My expensive silk blouses, my tailored work trousers, and my favorite cashmere sweaters were stuffed into the garbage, like worthless refuse. Preston had not packed my things. He had thrown them away. He wanted to erase my presence from this house as quickly and brutally as possible. I walked over to the bags, feeling a surge of cold clinical anger rather than sorrow. I knelt down to retrieve a practical pair of jeans and a dark turtleneck sweater I needed to get out of this torn, bloody gown. As I pulled the sweater from the plastic bag, my eyes drifted toward our king-sized bed. The duvet was pulled back, revealing the expensive white sheets. I stepped closer, noticing a splash of vibrant color resting near the pillows. It was a piece of crimson lace lingerie. It was small, delicate, and completely foreign to me. I stared at the garment lying casually on the bed where I had slept for the past 10 years. The reality of the situation locked into place. Preston was not just a financial failure and an abusive husband. He had been carrying on an affair right here in our own home. He brought another woman into the space I painstakingly restored. He let her sleep in our bed while I was out working to save his arrogant family from financial ruin. I picked up the crimson lace between my thumb and index finger. It felt cheap. The sheer audacity of his betrayal was staggering. He wanted me out tonight, not just to punish me for humiliating his father, but because he planned to bring this woman back to our home. I dropped the lingerie back onto the pillows. I calmly pulled off my ruined gown, letting the torn silk pool around my ankles. I pulled on my jeans and the dark cashmere sweater, relishing the warmth of the dry clothing. I walked to my private safe, hidden behind a false panel in the walk-in closet. I entered the biometric code and retrieved my passport and the encrypted hard drive containing all my independent business assets. I zipped my few belongings into a single leather duffel bag. I slung the strap over my shoulder, ready to leave this toxic prison forever. But before I could take a step toward the hallway, a sharp mechanical sound echoed from the ground floor. The electronic deadbolt on the front door whirred and clicked, heavy brass tumbling out of the locking mechanism. The heavy oak door swung open, hitting the entryway wall with a loud thud. I froze, standing perfectly still in the shadows of the master closet. Footsteps echoed against the marble foyer. Heavy, deliberate steps of two men walking with total ownership of the space. I heard Preston laughing, a cruel and arrogant sound. He was not alone. He had brought his legal mastermind with him. DeAndre spoke, his deep voice carrying clearly up the grand staircase. The lawyer was outlining the exact legal maneuvers he planned to execute by morning, detailing how they would freeze my bank accounts and ensure I left the marriage with nothing but the clothes on my back. Their footsteps moved past the kitchen and began ascending the stairs. They were heading directly toward the master bedroom, unaware that the woman they intended to destroy was standing quietly in the dark, waiting for them. I stood perfectly still in the darkness of the master closet, gripping the heavy strap of my leather duffel bag. The footsteps crossed the threshold of the bedroom. The harsh glare of the overhead lights flickered on instantly. Banishing the soft moonlight, Preston let out a breath. When he saw my ruined silk gown discarded on the floor, he knew immediately that I had bypassed his security measures. I did not wait for him to search the room. I stepped out of the shadows and walked calmly into the center of the master suite. My dark cashmere sweater and jeans provided a stark contrast to the glittering spectacle of the gala I had just escaped. Preston glared at me, his jaw clenched tight. The red mark from where he had struck my face was mirrored by the dark purple bruise blooming across my own cheekbone. "You always were a stubborn problem," Preston sneered, stepping aside to let his legal mastermind enter the room. DeAndre walked in with the absolute confidence of a man who owned the world. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his expression completely devoid of any human empathy. He carried a thick leather-bound folder in his right hand. He did not say a word of greeting. He simply walked over to the king-sized bed and dropped the heavy stack of legal documents onto the pristine white sheets. The heavy folder landed right next to the cheap crimson lace lingerie Preston had left out for his mistress. DeAndre adjusted his cuffs and looked at me with cold calculation. "We are going to make this very simple, Naomi." DeAndre began, his deep voice echoing in the large room. "You humiliated Richard tonight. You threatened the stability of the family fund. Therefore, your tenure in this family is officially terminated. The documents on that bed represent a clean break divorce settlement. At least that is how it is titled. It is actually a highly restrictive post-nuptial agreement drafted retroactively to protect Preston from your erratic behavior." I looked at the thick stack of papers, then back at the ruthless corporate lawyer. I did not shout or cry. I simply asked him to explain exactly how he planned to enforce a retroactive agreement. DeAndre smiled. It was a chilling, predatory expression. He relished the opportunity to dismantle an opponent. He stepped closer to the bed, tapping the leather folder with a manicured finger. "You see, Naomi, you made a critical error when you deposited your earnings into the joint marital accounts," DeAndre explained, using his sharpest legal jargon. "Over the past 18 months, I have been acting as Preston's fiduciary counsel. I established a series of shell corporations under the guise of commercial real estate investments. Every dollar you earned from your historic preservation business, every single wire transfer you made was systematically routed into those holding companies. We then executed a series of strategic internal loans that intentionally defaulted on paper. The liquidity did not vanish. It was legally restructured and transferred into an irrevocable offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands." My mind raced as I processed the sheer magnitude of their financial betrayal. They had not just planned to divorce me, they had been actively stealing from me for over a year. I stared at DeAndre, forcing him to reveal the rest of his malicious strategy. "And who is the beneficiary of this offshore trust?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. Camille, DeAndre replied without a single hint of remorse. "My wife is the sole beneficiary of the trust. Your life savings, your business profits, and every asset you brought into this marriage now legally belong to her. The accounts are entirely boxed out, shielded by international privacy laws. You have absolutely zero legal claim to your own money. You are completely bankrupt." "Naomi?" Preston barked a cruel, arrogant laugh. He walked over to the bed and picked up the crimson lingerie, tossing it carelessly onto the floor. "You actually thought you could walk into our gala and threaten my father?" Preston mocked, his eyes flashing with vindictive delight. "You thought wiring $200,000 made you powerful? You are nothing but a glorified construction worker. We took your money because you were too stupid to notice. Now you have no family to protect you, no savings to hire a lawyer, and absolutely no place to sleep tonight." I tightened my grip on the duffel bag, analyzing their entire strategy. They were relying on shock and financial devastation to force my compliance. They believed I was an isolated working-class woman who would crumble under the weight of their elite legal maneuvering. DeAndre reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a sleek silver pen. He clicked it once. The sharp metallic sound broke the heavy tension in the room. He held the pen out toward me, offering it like a weapon. "You have two choices," DeAndre said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, authoritative timbre. "You can take this pen and sign the agreement on the last page. If you sign, you agree to waive all right to spousal support and relinquish any claim to the stolen funds. In exchange, Preston is graciously offering you a $5,000 relocation fee. That is enough to rent a cheap apartment and start your pathetic life over somewhere else. You take the money and you walk out that door tonight." "And my second choice?" I asked, refusing to break eye contact with him. DeAndre stepped forward, his tall frame looming over me. He shoved the silver pen closer to my bruised face. "If you refuse to sign today, I will bury you in endless litigation, ensuring every dollar you make is garnished to pay our legal fees. Sign this. Take the $5,000 relocation fee and walk away, or I will personally bury you in so much litigation you will be paying legal fees until you are 70. I did not reach for the silver pen. I looked at DeAndre and then shifted my gaze to the thick leather-bound folder resting on my ruined bed. I reached out and picked up the heavy stack of documents. The paper felt thick and expensive. I flipped open the cover and began reading the clauses DeAndre had so meticulously drafted. The level of malice embedded in the legal jargon was genuinely impressive. They had not just included financial waivers. DeAndre had written in a permanent gag order, preventing me from ever speaking about the family or their business practices. There was a strict non-compete clause designed to completely destroy my historic preservation career by barring me from working within a 500-mile radius. The final page even included a drafted admission of fault, stating that I had caused the breakdown of the marriage due to my own unstable behavior. They wanted to strip me of my money, my career, my voice, and my sanity. I read the final lines, noting the specific blank space left for my signature. Preston watched me with a triumphant smirk, clearly believing that the sheer weight of the legal threats had finally crushed my spirit. DeAndre stood perfectly still, waiting for me to accept my total defeat. They both expected me to break down crying to beg for a larger settlement or to simply sign my life away out of sheer terror. Instead, I closed the folder. I looked DeAndre directly in the eyes. I gripped the thick stack of premium legal paper with both hands. I braced my wrists and twisted my grip, applying all my strength. The sound of thick paper tearing ripped through the silence of the master bedroom. I tore the entire post-nuptial agreement perfectly in half. I let the severed pieces of their meticulous legal trap fall from my hands. The heavy halves landed with a dull thud directly onto the toes of DeAndre's expensive Italian leather shoes. I turned my back on the ruthless lawyer and walked over to my dark corner of the room. I reached down and picked up the heavy strap of my leather duffel bag, slinging it securely over my shoulder. I stood tall, feeling the solid weight of my encrypted hard drive and my passport pressing against my side. I had everything I needed to destroy them. Preston stared at the torn documents on the floor and then erupted into a cruel, mocking laugh. "You are completely delusional, Naomi," he sneered, taking a step toward me. "You think tearing up a piece of paper changes your reality? You have absolutely nothing. You have no family to run to. You have no trust fund to fall back on. You have no powerful daddy to call for a rescue. You are just a stray dog we brought in from the cold." Preston continued to close the distance, his voice rising in volume and viciousness. "I gave you everything you have. I elevated you. And now you are going back to the gutter. Where exactly do you think you are going to go tonight? Your bank accounts are frozen. Your credit cards will decline the second you try to swipe them. You cannot afford a hotel. You cannot even afford a cab ride across the city. You will be sleeping on the wet concrete like a homeless beggar by midnight." DeAndre crossed his arms, looking at me with pure disdain. "You made a very poor calculation, Naomi. I will file the original digital copies tomorrow morning. You will be served with a lawsuit so massive it will ensure you never work in this state again. You should have taken the $5,000. I did not offer a single word of rebuttal. I did not need to defend myself to men who were already financially dead. I simply adjusted the strap of my duffel bag and started walking toward the bedroom door. Preston blocked my path, his face twisted with arrogant rage. He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. He shoved me forcefully toward the hallway. "Get out of my house!" Preston shouted, pushing me toward the grand staircase. "Get out before I have you arrested for trespassing!" I caught my balance and descended the stairs, my bare feet hitting the polished wood. Preston followed closely behind me, shoving me again when I reached the grand foyer. DeAndre descended the stairs at a slower pace, watching my eviction with clinical satisfaction. Preston marched to the heavy oak front door and yanked it open. A violent storm had rolled in from the coast while I was inside. The wind howled through the open doorway, driving sheets of freezing rain onto the marble floor of the foyer. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the manicured lawns and the dark brick driveway. The temperature had plummeted. Preston shoved me one final time, pushing me hard through the open doorway. I stumbled onto the wet stone porch, barely keeping my footing. The freezing rain instantly soaked my dark cashmere sweater and my jeans. I turned around to face my husband. Preston stood in the warm, dry foyer, a cruel smile plastered across his face. "Welcome back to the real world," Preston mocked, raising his voice to be heard over the roaring wind. "Have a nice life in the gutter, Naomi." He grabbed the heavy brass handle and slammed the oak door shut. The loud crack of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed over the thunder. I was officially locked out in the cold. I walked slowly down the stone steps and stepped onto the flooded brick driveway. The freezing rain beat down on my shoulders, matting my hair against my bruised cheek. The wind whipped past me, chilling me to the bone. I stood completely alone on the dark curb of the massive estate, gripping my leather duffel bag. The street was entirely empty. The upscale neighborhood was silent, except for the violent sounds of the pouring rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Preston and DeAndre were inside drinking bourbon and celebrating my destruction. They believed I was utterly defeated. I stared down the long, dark street, refusing to shiver. Suddenly, the pitch-black darkness of the wealthy neighborhood was pierced by a blinding set of LED headlights. The intense white beams cut through the driving rain, sweeping across the wet pavement. It was not just one vehicle. A massive fleet of 3 identical black Cadillac Escalades emerged from the storm. The heavy luxury SUVs drove in perfect, menacing synchronization. The convoy glided smoothly up the street, their tires hissing against the flooded asphalt. The 3 massive vehicles pulled up to the curb and came to a seamless halt directly in front of me. The heavy engines idled with a low, powerful hum vibrating through the flooded pavement beneath my bare feet. Rain lashed against the dark-tinted windows, but the convoy remained perfectly still. The synchronized arrival of these luxury SUVs was not a coincidence. It was a calculated display of absolute precision and terrifying resources. I stood there shivering in my soaked cashmere sweater, clutching my leather duffel bag as the blinding white headlights cut through the torrential downpour. Behind me, the heavy oak front door of the estate swung open once again. Preston and DeAndre stepped out onto the sheltered stone porch, drawn by the sudden illumination of the street. They had likely expected to see me crawling away into the darkness or begging on my knees. Instead, they found me illuminated by a fleet of vehicles that cost more than their combined annual salaries. I could hear Preston scoffing over the roaring wind, clearly assuming this was some sort of mistake, or a lost motorcade making a turn in his exclusive neighborhood. He leaned against the brick pillar, crossing his arms with arrogant amusement. DeAndre stood beside him, his sharp legal mind already trying to process the highly unusual disruption. The rear door of the lead Escalade swung open. A man in a pristine dark suit stepped out into the freezing rain. He did not flinch against the storm. He opened a massive black umbrella, holding it steady with military discipline. He turned and extended his free hand toward the dark interior of the vehicle. Then my father stepped out. Harrison moved with the kind of effortless authority that cannot be bought or faked. He wore a charcoal overcoat layered over a bespoke midnight blue suit. He did not rush. He did not look around the neighborhood with the desperate curiosity of a man trying to gauge his social standing. He already owned the world, and his posture demanded immediate submission from everything around him. He walked toward me, his leather shoes stepping directly into the freezing puddles without a single moment of hesitation. The security guard kept the umbrella perfectly centered over his head, shielding him from the violent storm. I had not seen my father in a decade. I had walked away from his towering empire because I wanted to prove I could build a life entirely on my own merits. I wanted to be loved for my hard work and my character, not for the billions attached to my last name. Looking at him now, I realized how incredibly foolish my experiment had been. Harrison stopped 2 feet in front of me. The icy rain was instantly blocked by the wide canopy of the black umbrella. My father did not look at the massive house behind me. He did not look at the expensive cars in Preston's driveway. He only looked at me. His sharp dark eyes scanned my soaked clothes, my shivering frame, and my bare feet standing on the freezing concrete. Then his gaze locked onto the left side of my face. He saw the dark purple bruise blooming across my cheekbone. He saw my split lip. The temperature under that umbrella seemed to drop another 20 degrees. I watched the muscles in my father's jaw clench. A terrifying, silent fury radiated from him so intensely that the security guard beside him visibly stiffened. Harrison was a man who dismantled global corporations before breakfast. Seeing his only daughter physically assaulted pushed him to the absolute edge of his legendary restraint. But he did not yell. He did not charge the porch. He simply unbuttoned his heavy cashmere overcoat and slipped it off his shoulders. He stepped forward and wrapped the thick, warm fabric around my shivering shoulders. The coat smelled of cedar and expensive cologne, providing an instant shield against the biting cold. He pulled the lapels tight across my chest, securing my leather duffel bag underneath the heavy wool. He lifted his hand and gently brushed a wet strand of hair away from my uninjured cheek. "Get in, sweetheart," Harrison said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that carried absolute finality. "Their game is over." On the stone porch, Preston let out a loud, mocking laugh, trying to assert his dominance over a situation he fundamentally did not understand. He stepped forward to the edge of the stairs, cupping his hands around his mouth to shout over the storm. "Who is this Naomi Preston?" yelled his voice dripping with condescension. "Did you call a taxi service to come rescue you from the gutter? You are going to need a lot more than a fancy ride to save you from what we are filing tomorrow morning." Harrison finally shifted his gaze. He looked past me, staring directly at the man who had just struck his daughter. My father did not shout back. He did not offer a single word of rebuttal or threat. He simply looked at Preston with the absolute cold disgust usually reserved for a cockroach. The sheer weight of that silent stare was devastating. Preston actually took a physical step backward, his arrogant smile faltering under the crushing intimidation of a true apex predator. DeAndre stopped leaning against the pillar, his posture going rigid as he recognized the unspoken power radiating from the street. My father placed a firm hand on my back and guided me toward the open door of the Escalade. I climbed into the warm leather interior, pulling my legs inside. Harrison slid in right beside me, taking the seat next to mine. The security guard closed the heavy armored door, shutting out the howling wind and the freezing rain entirely. The cabin was silent, incredibly warm, and completely secure. Without a single command being spoken, the convoy began to move. The three massive vehicles accelerated smoothly, gliding away from the curb in perfect unison. I looked out the tinted window as we drove away, leaving Preston and DeAndre standing on the porch of the house I had spent a decade restoring. They were shrinking rapidly into the distance, looking small and entirely insignificant against the dark backdrop of the storm. They thought they had won. They thought they had stripped me of everything. Back on the wet stone porch, Preston scoffed, shaking his head as the taillights disappeared around the corner. "She is pathetic," Preston muttered, turning back toward the heavy oak door. "She probably begged some high-end car service to let her ride on credit." "It does not matter. The post-nuptial agreement stands. She is entirely bankrupt by morning. Let us go finish that bourbon." DeAndre did not respond immediately. The brilliant corporate lawyer stood frozen, staring at the empty street. Something about the precision of that convoy unsettled his deeply analytical mind. He reached into his tailored suit jacket as his phone began to vibrate violently. It was not a standard text message notification. It was the high-pitched emergency alert tone tied exclusively to his secure banking application. DeAndre swiped the screen, his dark eyes scanning the urgent notification. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his expression slack with sudden, absolute terror. Preston stopped at the door, looking back at his brother-in-law. "What is it?" Preston asked, annoyed by the delay. DeAndre swallowed hard, his thumb hovering over the glaring red text on his screen. "A massive withdrawal attempt on our firm's primary credit line was just initiated." DeAndre whispered, his voice cracking with panic. "And it was instantly blocked by an unknown corporate entity. Our entire operating liquidity has just been seized." The heavy armored doors of the Escalade insulated us entirely from the violent storm outside and the financial panic I knew was erupting on my former front porch. My father did not speak during the drive. He simply stared straight ahead, his presence a silent fortress against the chaos of the night. I pulled his cashmere overcoat tighter around my shivering frame, gripping my leather duffel bag. We drove through the slick, flooded streets of the city, leaving the affluent suburbs behind and entering the towering concrete canyons of the financial district. The convoy descended seamlessly into a highly secured underground parking facility. Steel gates rolled shut behind us, locking out the world. A private elevator whisked us upward, ascending 60 floors without a single sound. The polished steel doors parted to reveal my father's $50 million penthouse. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture spanning the entire top floor of the skyscraper. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a panoramic view of the storm-battered city. The interior was a study in perfectly calculated luxury, featuring dark slate floors, rare obsidian accents, and austere minimalist furniture that projected absolute power. A small team of staff was already waiting, having been alerted the moment my father's motorcade picked me up. A quiet, efficient woman guided me into a massive guest suite. She took my soaked clothes and handed me a plush robe, followed by a perfectly tailored pair of dark trousers and a heavy silk blouse. The dry garments felt like armor against my chilled skin. When I emerged back into the main living area, a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea was waiting for me on a glass table. Beside the table stood a man carrying a medical bag. My father never left anything to chance, and he had summoned his personal concierge physician. The doctor worked in total silence. He carefully examined my jaw, checking for fractures before applying a specialized cooling gel to the dark purple bruise blooming across my cheekbone. The stinging pain began to recede, almost immediately replaced by a dull, manageable ache. The doctor packed up his bag, gave my father a sharp nod, confirming I was structurally sound, and quietly exited the penthouse. I stood by the massive windows looking out at the lightning striking the distant skyscrapers. I held the warm teacup in both hands, letting the heat seep into my bones. Harrison walked up behind me, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. He did not look at the storm. He looked at my reflection in the glass. 10 years, Naomi, he said, his deep voice cutting through the quiet hum of the penthouse climate control. 10 years you spent playing house with parasites. You rejected your seat at the board. You rejected the security detail. You rejected your own name. I turned to face him, feeling the familiar weight of our old arguments rising to the surface. I wanted to build something very real, Dad, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I wanted to know what it felt like to create a legacy with my own 2 hands, without the shadow of Harrison Global looming over every achievement. I wanted to find a man who loved me for my mind and my character, not because marrying me meant access to a $1 billion trust fund. My father took a slow sip of his scotch, his dark eyes locked onto mine. And did you find that genuine love, Naomi? Did your little experiment in playing a working-class citizen yield the results you anticipated? The words stung because they were absolutely true. My 10-year marriage was a complete fabrication. Preston had not loved my character. He had tolerated me because I was useful. He enjoyed playing the wealthy benefactor to a woman he believed was beneath him socially. When my usefulness shifted, when I dared to expose his financial incompetence in front of his elite peers, his affection instantly transformed into physical violence and legal theft. He stripped me of the modest savings I had built, digging through the dirt of old houses. I looked down at the dark slate floor. No, I admitted quietly. I was wrong. They did not want a partner. They wanted a prop. And when I stopped being a convenient prop, they locked me out in the freezing rain and tried to steal everything I earned. Harrison set his crystal tumbler down on the glass table with a sharp, decisive clack. He walked over and stood directly in front of me, placing his hands squarely on my shoulders. His gaze was intense, burning with the kind of ruthless protectiveness that built empires. You are a Harrison, he stated firmly. We do not tolerate disrespect, and we absolutely do not allow thieves to walk away with our assets. You wanted to prove you could survive in the real world. You survived. But survival is for the weak. We do not just survive, we conquer. He stepped back and picked up a sleek silver iPad from his desk. He walked back and held the device out to me. You tried it your way, Naomi, my father said, his tone shifting from parental concern to pure corporate warfare. Now we will do it mine. I took the tablet from his hands. The screen was illuminated with a live high-level financial dashboard. It was not a public stock ticker. It was a proprietary back-channel data feed assessing the internal liquidity of Richard's wealth management fund. The charts were flooded with red lines. I scrolled past the initial summaries, absorbing the raw data. DeAndre and Preston had been desperately shuffling money through shell corporations trying to hide their toxic assets. The $200,000 I had wired them was barely a drop in an endless ocean of debt. They were highly over-leveraged on commercial real estate, and their margin calls were multiplying by the hour. The fund was actively hemorrhaging money at an incredibly unsustainable rate. My father watched my reaction carefully. He knew me well enough to understand that I was not looking for a simple act of vengeance. I did not want Preston beaten in an alley, and I certainly did not want my father to just throw money at the problem until it disappeared. I wanted them dismantled. I wanted the arrogant structure they had built their entire identity upon to be taken apart brick by brick until nothing remained but the truth of their incompetence. We can crush them by morning, Naomi Harrison said, his voice steady and clinical. One phone call to the regulatory boards and they are finished. Their firm will be shuttered and DeAndre will be facing disbarment before he finishes his morning coffee. I shook my head, my eyes still locked on the red lines bleeding across the iPad screen. No, I replied softly. If you destroy them from the outside, they will just spin a narrative that they were the victims of a hostile corporate takeover. They will play the martyrs. They need to be the architects of their own destruction. I want them to look at the paperwork and realize they built their own guillotine. Harrison smiled, a terrifying, proud expression that mirrored my own cold calculation. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a heavy silver pen, placing it next to a leather-bound contract on his desk. Then it is time you stopped playing in the dirt and took your proper place, he said. The position of Executive Vice President of Acquisitions has been empty for 3 years. I have been holding it for you. Sign the contract, Naomi. Become the apex predator you were born to be. I did not hesitate. I picked up the silver pen. It felt significantly heavier than the cheap plastic one DeAndre had tried to force on me just hours ago. I signed my full legal name, Naomi Harrison, securing my position as the second most powerful executive at Harrison Global. Good, my father said, taking the contract and locking it in a secure drawer. Now show me how you plan to execute this family. I pulled up the detailed portfolio of Richard's wealth management fund on the iPad. I bypassed the standard metrics and dug directly into their hard assets. Preston and DeAndre had been incredibly sloppy attempting to mask their leverage. I highlighted a specific commercial real estate development located in the booming tech corridor of the city. It was a massive multi-use complex projected to house luxury retail spaces and high-end corporate offices. Look at this project, I said, pointing to the staggering numbers attached to the development. 6 months ago, Preston brought this proposal to the dinner table, bragging about how it would cement their legacy. I reviewed the architectural plans and the structural assessments. I specifically warned him that the foundation of the primary building was compromised by a subterranean water table issue. I told him the remediation costs alone would bankrupt the project before they even poured the first floor of concrete. Harrison leaned over, examining the data. And he ignored your assessment. Completely? I confirmed, my voice hardening at the memory. He told me I was just a glorified contractor who did not understand high-level commercial financing. He said his engineers assured him the water issue was a minor inconvenience. I tapped the screen, bringing up the current construction reports. It was not a minor inconvenience. They are currently $60 million over budget, just trying to keep the foundation from sinking into the mud. They leveraged the entire family fund against this single development. When the margin calls hit last month, they started pulling liquidity from their clients' accounts to cover the construction delays. That is why they stole my money. They are bleeding cash, trying to plug a hole in a sinking ship. My father's eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction. They violated their fiduciary duties to cover gross incompetence. It is a classic amateur mistake. But how does that allow you to dismantle them? I smiled, swiping the screen to reveal the financing structure of the failing development. Because they are out of time, Dad. The primary construction loan is due for a massive balloon payment in exactly 5 days. If they default, the bank seizes the development and the entire wealth management fund collapses under the cross-collateralization clauses DeAndre so arrogantly drafted. I looked up from the screen, meeting my father's intense gaze. They are desperate. They need a massive infusion of capital immediately to avoid total bankruptcy. They are currently seeking a private equity bailout of $150 million to cover the balloon payment and keep the project afloat. Harrison crossed his arms, leaning back against his heavy mahogany desk. And who exactly are they courting for this desperate bailout? I turned the iPad around so my father could see the active communication logs intercepted by his own corporate espionage team. Richard and Preston had been sending increasingly frantic emails and meeting requests to a single private equity titan. They believed this titan was their only hope for survival. They were practically begging for an audience willing to offer absurdly favorable terms just to secure the cash. They are courting us. I said, the reality of the situation perfectly aligning. Richard and Preston are currently begging Harrison Global for a $150 million lifeline. They have absolutely no idea that the woman they just locked out in the freezing rain is the executive vice president of the very company they are relying on to save their lives. The morning after my father's intervention, the reality of my new position settled over me. I was no longer the unassuming daughter-in-law trying to fit into a world that despised me. I was Naomi Harrison, Executive Vice President of Acquisitions, and I had the full weight of a global empire at my disposal. While I spent the morning reviewing the intricate financial web DeAndre and Preston had woven to cover their incompetence, my former family was busy constructing a very different narrative. Oblivious to the true identity of the woman they had locked out in the rain, Beatrice and Camille launched a coordinated and vicious smear campaign across their elite social circles. My phone, which I had kept active specifically to monitor their behavior, began buzzing with forwarded messages and screenshots from former acquaintances. Beatrice, ever the calculating socialite, wasted no time weaponizing the country club gossip network. At a charity luncheon she hosted that very morning, she played the part of the devastated, betrayed mother-in-law to perfection. According to the accounts relayed to me, Beatrice stood before her peers, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and wove a tale of profound deception. She claimed that I had been systematically embezzling funds from Preston's personal accounts for years, hiding the money in offshore accounts. The story she spun painted me as a manipulative gold digger who had feigned a simple working-class background only to bleed her son dry. Camille, eager to participate in my destruction, added her own venomous details to the narrative. She gleefully told anyone who would listen that the reason I had disappeared so quickly after the gala was because I had a secret benefactor waiting in the wings. She described the fleet of black Escalades that had arrived to pick me up, twisting the arrival of my father's security detail into a scandalous affair. Camille claimed that I had run off with a wealthy, older sugar daddy, abandoning my marriage the moment my embezzlement was discovered. The sheer audacity of their lies was breathtaking, but in the echo chamber of their privileged world, the story took root immediately. They were banking on my silence, assuming I was too impoverished and humiliated to defend myself against their combined social influence. The malicious rumors were merely the social component of their attack. Preston, furious and desperate to regain the power he felt slipping away, decided to dismantle the only thing he thought I still possessed: my career. My historic preservation business was built on a decade of meticulous work, specialized knowledge, and relationships with key preservation boards across the state. Preston, leveraging his position at the Wealth Management Fund and the influence of his father's name, began calling in favors. He contacted the chairman of 3 major historic preservation boards, men who either owed his family money or relied on their firm for investment advice. By early afternoon, the consequences of Preston's aggressive networking materialized. I received a formal email from the State Historical Commission notifying me that my consulting contract for a highly publicized downtown revitalization project had been abruptly terminated, citing unforeseen administrative restructuring. Less than an hour later, 2 more emails arrived from separate municipal preservation boards, indefinitely suspending my involvement in upcoming heritage site evaluations. Preston had successfully blacklisted me from the primary sources of my professional income. He had orchestrated a coordinated strike to ensure that, even if I tried to rebuild my life, I would find every door firmly shut. The final insult arrived via text message, my phone chime displaying a notification from Preston. I opened the message to find a screenshot of an email from one of the board chairmen confirming the termination of my contract. Beneath the image, Preston had typed a single gloating sentence. "I told you that you were going back to the gutter. You are finished in this city." He was reveling in his perceived victory, confident that he had completely neutralized the threat I posed and reasserted his absolute dominance over my life. I stared at the text message, analyzing the pathetic arrogance behind it. Preston believed he was playing a high-stakes game of chess, strategically removing my pieces from the board. He did not realize that while he was busy manipulating local preservation boards, I was operating on a scale he could not even begin to comprehend. I did not feel the crushing despair he intended to inflict. Instead, his petty vindictiveness only solidified my resolve to execute the financial dismantling I had planned. I did not reply to his text. I did not offer him the satisfaction of knowing he had provoked a reaction. Silence in this instance was the most terrifying response I could give. I set my phone face down on the heavy mahogany desk in my new office at Harrison Global. I turned my attention back to the sleek silver iPad displaying the comprehensive financial data of the Preston family's various assets and affiliations. My father's intelligence team had compiled a meticulous dossier on Beatrice's social standing, recognizing that her power in their circles was entirely dependent on her position as the president of the exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club. It was the same club where she had hosted the anniversary gala, the same club where she was currently spreading her malicious lies about me. The country club, like many elite institutions, relied heavily on discreet financing to maintain its pristine golf courses, lavish facilities, and extravagant events. I pulled up the debt structure for Oak Ridge. The club had recently undertaken a massive multi-million-dollar renovation of its clubhouse and dining facilities, funded by a substantial line of credit from a regional bank. That line of credit was currently active, and the debt was bundled into a larger portfolio managed by a secondary financial institution. I pressed a button on the intercom, connecting me directly to the acquisitions team standing by. I instructed them to initiate the immediate purchase of the entire debt portfolio holding the Oak Ridge Country Club's line of credit. The maneuver was swift, aggressive, and entirely legal. Within 20 minutes, the acquisition was finalized. Harrison Global was now the primary debt holder for the institution that served as the foundation of Beatrice's social empire. I smiled, a cold, calculated expression mirroring my father's. Beatrice believed she controlled the narrative within the walls of that club. She had no idea that I now owned the walls themselves. I set the Oak Ridge Country Club acquisition file aside and shifted my focus back to the primary target. Beatrice's social destruction was merely a localized tremor. The absolute financial obliteration of Richard's wealth management firm was the impending earthquake. I walked out of my executive office and down the glass-lined corridor to the secure financial war room at the heart of Harrison Global. The space was a command center of blinking servers and wall-to-wall digital displays tracking global market fluctuations. Inside, 5 of my father's most ruthless forensic accountants were already dissecting the bailout application. Preston and DeAndre had so desperately submitted. I took a seat at the head of the long obsidian conference table. The lead accountant, a sharp-featured man named David, projected a complex web of financial transactions onto the main screen. He had been tracing the exact origins of the liquidity Preston claimed his firm possessed to qualify for a $150 million bailout from a titan like Harrison Global. An applicant must prove they have substantial unencumbered skin in the game. Preston's application boasted a sudden massive influx of cash over the past 48 hours. I instructed David to dig directly into the routing numbers of those recent deposits. The forensic team unleashed their proprietary algorithms. We watched the data populate in real time, stripping away the layers of corporate camouflage DeAndre had meticulously constructed. The brilliant corporate lawyer thought he was playing a localized game of financial chess against provincial regulators. He did not realize he was actively being audited by a global superpower that possessed unrestricted access to international banking backdoors. The screen lit up with a series of offshore holding accounts. I recognized the Cayman Islands trust DeAndre had thrown in my face the night he evicted me. But the money did not stop there. David isolated the digital paper trail. The funds had been aggressively cycled back into domestic accounts, masking their origin before being deposited into Preston's primary corporate liquidity pool. The accounting team ran a comparative analysis against the firm's client ledger. The results flashed on the screen in bright red alert blocks. The room fell entirely silent. DeAndre had not just hidden my stolen savings in an offshore trust. He had weaponized them to meet the stringent liquidity requirements for the Harrison Global bailout application. DeAndre had executed a highly illegal commingling maneuver. He had systematically raided the escrow accounts of their most vulnerable clients. He swept the remaining balances of several elderly investors, a local teacher's pension fund, and every single cent of the money he had stolen from my historic preservation business. He bundled those stolen funds and presented them on the official application as Preston's personal unencumbered capital. I stared at the glowing red lines connecting the stolen client funds directly to Preston's fraudulent balance sheet. The sheer arrogant stupidity of their actions was staggering. DeAndre had facilitated massive wire fraud. Preston had signed his name to fabricated federal financial documents. They were no longer just terrible husbands and elitist snobs. They had actively crossed the line into severe federal criminality. This was a textbook Securities and Exchange Commission violation of the highest order. David looked across the table at me, pushing a printed dossier of the traced funds forward. He confirmed what I already knew. This is not a civil dispute anymore. Naomi, they have committed egregious federal crimes. If we submit this data packet to the regulatory authorities, the FBI will be raiding their corporate headquarters by tomorrow afternoon. I picked up the thick dossier, feeling the incredible weight of the evidence in my hands. Preston had mocked me, standing in his grand foyer, telling me I had absolutely no money to fight them. DeAndre had threatened to bury me in endless litigation, assuming I would be crushed under his superior legal intellect. They believed they were untouchable masters of the universe. Instead, they had unknowingly handed me the exact weapon required to completely annihilate them. This single dossier contained the absolute power to have DeAndre stripped of his legal license and permanently disbarred. It held the undeniable proof necessary to put Preston in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. Richard's legacy, his entire identity built on the illusion of superior financial acumen, would be reduced to a spectacular criminal scandal. I held their complete destruction in my hands. But simply handing the file over to the federal authorities was too quick. It was too impersonal. I did not want them arrested in the comfort of their own office, blissfully unaware of who had orchestrated their downfall. I wanted them to walk willingly into the trap. I wanted them to look into the eyes of the woman they had abused and discarded in the freezing rain and realize that she was the absolute architect of their ruin. I set the heavy dossier back down on the cold, polished obsidian table. I looked at the lead accountant and instructed him to secure the data packet but withhold it from the regulatory agencies for exactly 24 hours. I then pulled out my encrypted corporate phone and opened the executive scheduling application. I pulled up the pending bailout request that had been submitted by Richard's struggling wealth management firm. The application was flagged as urgent begging for immediate review. I bypassed the standard preliminary approval process. I authorized a direct override granting their firm an immediate in-person meeting to finalize the terms of the $150 million capital injection. I typed a formal corporate response from the Harrison Global Executive Desk. The message congratulated them on passing the initial liquidity audit and invited Richard Preston and DeAndre to our global headquarters for a final signing ceremony at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I hit the send button on the illuminated screen. The trap was now officially set in motion. They were blindly coming right to me to finalize their own total destruction. The notification arrived in DeAndre's secure corporate inbox precisely at 4 p.m. The subject line was stark and unadorned: Harrison Global Capital Injection Final Review. DeAndre stared at the screen, his brilliant legal mind instantly recognizing the magnitude of the sender. It was not an automated response from a lower-level analyst. The email had been dispatched directly from the executive acquisitions desk of the most ruthless private equity firm on the Eastern Seaboard. DeAndre printed the email and walked briskly down the corridor of the wealth management firm. He bypassed Richard's corner office and headed straight for Preston's suite. He did not knock. He pushed the heavy glass door open and dropped the single sheet of premium paper onto Preston's desk. Preston picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the brief formal text. The color rushed back into his face, replacing the pale, panicked pallor he had worn since the morning. He read the words aloud, savoring the syllables. Congratulations on passing the initial liquidity audit. You are invited to our global headquarters for a final signing ceremony at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Preston leaned back in his Italian leather chair, a slow, arrogant smile spreading across his face. He let out a sharp bark of laughter. "We did it," he said, tossing the paper back onto the desk. The old man was right. You just have to project strength and the market bends to your will. DeAndre walked over to the private bar in the corner of the office. He poured 2 glasses of 20-year-old single malt scotch, his movements smooth and practiced. "It wasn't projecting strength, Preston," DeAndre corrected, handing a glass to his brother-in-law. "It was aggressive, highly creative legal structuring. We successfully insulated the firm's vulnerabilities and presented a flawless balance sheet to the most rigorous auditors in the city. We outsmarted Harrison Global." Preston raised his glass, clinking it against DeAndre's. "To the superior bloodline," Preston mocked, echoing his father's disastrous toast from the night before. "And to the absolute disappearance of my soon-to-be ex-wife. Have you heard a single word from her since we threw her out?" "Not a whisper," DeAndre replied, taking a slow sip of the expensive scotch. "She is likely sitting in some cheap motel room, realizing exactly how completely we dismantled her. Without access to her funds or her preservation contracts, she has zero leverage. She is entirely neutralized." Preston walked over to his humidor and pulled out 2 premium Cuban cigars. He handed one to DeAndre and clipped the end of his own. "It is almost pathetic." Preston scoffed, lighting the cigar and exhaling a thick cloud of blue smoke. "She actually thought wiring a couple $100,000 gave her power. She had no idea she was playing in a league where $150 million is just a signature on a piece of paper." While the men celebrated their perceived victory with scotch and cigars, Camille was actively executing her own form of financial triumph. DeAndre had texted her the moment the Harrison Global email arrived, assuring his wife that the firm's liquidity crisis was officially resolved. Armed with the absolute certainty of a massive impending bailout, Camille felt entirely justified in rewarding herself for the stress she had endured. She bypassed her personal credit cards, which were nearing their limits, and opted for the black corporate card tied directly to the firm's executive expense account. She marched into the city's most exclusive jewelry boutique with the entitlement of a woman who believed she possessed infinite wealth. Camille did not browse, she pointed. She selected a matching set of diamond tennis bracelets, a platinum and sapphire necklace, and a limited edition timepiece for DeAndre. When the boutique manager hesitated slightly at the staggering total, Camille simply handed over the heavy metal corporate card. "Run it," she commanded, her tone dripping with aristocratic impatience. "And have the items couriered to my estate this evening." The transaction, totaling just under $500,000, processed without a hitch. The firm's credit lines, artificially inflated by DeAndre's illegal commingling of stolen client funds, readily absorbed the massive charge. Camille walked out of the boutique feeling utterly invincible, oblivious to the fact that she had just charged $500,000 to an account that was currently under active surveillance by federal forensic accountants. Back at the firm, DeAndre returned to his office feeling a surge of absolute dominance. The Harrison Global deal was secured. His aggressive legal maneuvering had saved the family empire. There was only one loose end remaining to be tied. He picked up his phone and dialed the number he had systematically blocked from accessing any of her own assets. The call went straight to voicemail, exactly as he anticipated. DeAndre waited for the beep, a cruel, satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Naomi," DeAndre began, his voice dropping into its most intimidating authoritative register. "I am calling to formally notify you that I have officially filed the divorce petition in absentia with the state court. Given your failure to respond or retain counsel, we are proceeding with a default judgment." He paused, relishing the power he held over her future. "I also want to inform you that your preservation contracts have been permanently reassigned. Your reputation in this city is entirely finished. I strongly suggest you take the $5,000 relocation fee I offered and leave the state. If you attempt to contest this divorce or contact this family again, I will personally ensure you are held liable for the entirety of our legal fees. You played a very stupid game, Naomi, and you lost everything. DeAndre ended the call and tossed the phone onto his desk. He checked his watch. It was 5:30 p.m. He packed his briefcase ready to head home and celebrate with Camille. Tomorrow morning they would sign the paperwork with Harrison Global and their financial supremacy would be permanently restored. 10 miles away, high above the city skyline, I stood in my executive office at Harrison Global. The storm from the previous night had cleared, leaving the city washed clean and glittering in the late afternoon sun. I was dressed in a bespoke tailored charcoal suit, the fabric moving like armor against my skin. The bruise on my cheek was expertly concealed by a thin layer of makeup, but the cold, calculating fury beneath it remained entirely visible. I held my encrypted corporate phone in my hand, listening to the voicemail DeAndre had just left. His arrogant, threatening words echoed in the silent, glass-walled office. He truly believed he had won. He believed he had crushed me under the weight of his superior intellect and legal maneuvering. I let the voicemail play to the very end. I did not feel fear. I did not feel intimidation. I felt a terrifying, absolute calm. I placed the phone face down on my heavy mahogany desk. I reached forward and pressed the silver intercom button, connecting me directly to the lead forensic accountant in the financial war room. "David," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "Yes, Ms. Harrison," the accountant replied instantly. "The audit is complete." I instructed, staring out at the city they thought they controlled. "Freeze their corporate accounts, all of them, effective at exactly 9 a.m. tomorrow." While I sat in my office at Harrison Global watching the clock inch closer to 9, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law were completely oblivious. Beatrice and Camille started their day early, driven by the absolute certainty that Preston and Richard were finalizing a massive bailout. In their minds, the family empire was saved. To celebrate their perceived triumph, they indulged in a morning shopping spree at the most exclusive luxury boutique on the city's wealthiest avenue. The boutique was a sanctuary of high fashion, featuring Italian marble floors and velvet seating. Beatrice and Camille glided through the glass doors at precisely 8:45. Acting as though they owned the building, they demanded the immediate attention of the store manager. A sharply dressed man named Francois ordered his staff to bring trays of sparkling water. He hovered around the women as they browsed, pointing at items with lazy arrogance. Camille was particularly aggressive in her selections, empowered by the $500,000 she successfully charged the previous evening. She felt completely invincible. She directed the sales associates to pull 3 limited edition leather handbags, 5 pairs of custom runway shoes, and a heavily embellished evening gown. Beatrice matched her enthusiasm, piling vintage silk scarves and diamond-encrusted accessories onto the checkout counter. They laughed loudly, discussing winter vacations and praising Preston's business acumen, ensuring every wealthy patron heard about their supposedly thriving fund. The clock ticked forward. It was exactly 9 o'clock. At that precise second, my forensic accountants executed the absolute freeze directive across the entire financial network tied to Richard's firm. The digital locks slammed shut on the corporate accounts, the personal offshore trusts, the escrow holdings, and every single credit line DeAndre had illegally inflated. The flow of stolen liquidity was instantly severed. It was 9:05 when Beatrice and Camille finally approached the polished mahogany checkout counter to finalize their massive haul. Francois stood behind the register, smiling warmly as his assistants carefully wrapped the designer goods in crisp tissue paper. The total purchase amounted to just over $120,000. Camille did not even blink at the staggering number. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her heavy platinum corporate card, dropping it onto the counter with a loud clack. Francois picked up the card and inserted it into the encrypted payment terminal. He tapped the screen, waiting for the familiar approving chime. Instead, the machine emitted a harsh, sharp beep. A glaring red error message flashed across the digital display. Francois frowned, slightly pulling the card out and wiping the chip on his sleeve. "My apologies, madam," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "It seems we have a slight connection error. Let me try running it one more time." He inserted the platinum card again. The machine, buzzed, instantly declined. Camille rolled her eyes, letting out an exaggerated sigh of annoyance. "The bank is probably putting a fraud hold on it because the purchase is so large," she stated, waving her hand dismissively. "Just force it through manually." "Francois, my husband is closing a massive deal this morning. I am afraid I cannot override a hard decline from the issuing bank." Madame Francois replied, his fawning demeanor cooling slightly. "The terminal is explicitly instructing me to retain the card." Beatrice stepped forward, her face flushing with indignant anger. "Do not be ridiculous," she snapped, snatching the platinum card from the counter before Francois could confiscate it. "Their system is clearly malfunctioning. Here, use my card." Beatrice produced an exclusive black metal card tied directly to Richard's primary executive account. She handed it to the manager with a triumphant smirk, expecting the problem to be instantly resolved. Francois processed the black card. The terminal beeped a third time. The red light illuminated the counter. "Declined." The polite smile completely vanished from Francois's face. He placed the black card back on the mahogany surface and took a deliberate step backward. "I am very sorry, ladies," he announced, his voice projecting clearly across the quiet boutique. "Both of your primary accounts have been entirely declined by your financial institutions. Do you perhaps have another form of payment you would like to provide?" He spoke loudly enough that the other elite shoppers stopped what they were doing and turned to look. The wealthy patrons exchanged eager, whispered comments. In their hyper-competitive social circle, a declined credit card was the ultimate mark of shame. Beatrice turned a violent shade of pale. She snatched her black card off the counter, her hands trembling with a mixture of rage and sudden terrifying panic. "This is completely unacceptable," she hissed, keeping her voice low to avoid further embarrassment. "Richard is meeting with Harrison Global right now. I will call him and have this fixed immediately." Beatrice pulled out her phone and dialed her husband's private number. She paced nervously. The line rang repeatedly before transferring to voicemail. Richard was sitting in my glass boardroom, entirely cut off from the outside world. Camille felt a cold knot of dread. She pulled out her own phone, her manicured fingers shaking as she bypassed her contacts and dialed DeAndre's direct line. She turned away from the staring crowd to hide her rising hysteria. DeAndre answered on the second ring. He was striding confidently through the marble lobby of his law office, preparing to review the final bailout documents. "What is it, Camille?" he asked. "DeAndre, you need to fix the bank accounts right now," Camille hissed frantically. "My platinum card just declined and Mom's executive black card declined too. Call the bank and clear the fraud hold immediately." DeAndre stopped walking. His polished leather shoes halted in the center of the lobby. He pulled out his encrypted smartphone and quickly opened his secure banking application. He expected to see a standard hold. Instead, DeAndre realizes every single account tied to the family firm is locked due to suspicious activity pending investor review. DeAndre stared at his phone screen, refusing to believe the red notification displaying the lock on all family accounts. Camille was screaming on the other end, demanding he fix the declined cards immediately, but her frantic voice sounded like distant static. He abruptly ended the call, severing her panicked demands without offering a word of reassurance. The corporate lawyer stood perfectly still in the center of his prestigious law firm lobby, holding the smartphone in his trembling hand. This was not a standard banking error or a simple fraud hold. The specific phrasing indicated a catastrophic intervention from a much higher financial authority. Suspicious activity pending investor review meant the institutional backers had triggered a complete structural freeze on every asset tied to Richard and Preston. DeAndre forced his breathing to slow, relying on cutthroat legal experience to suppress his rising panic. He shoved the phone into his tailored suit pocket and adjusted his cuffs, adopting his usual mask of arrogant invincibility. He needed to reach his private office, access the secure terminal, and manually override the freeze using his emergency backdoor protocols. He took a confident step forward, but stopped dead in his tracks. The atmosphere in the grand marble lobby was completely wrong. The firm usually buzzed with the energetic hum of paralegals rushing between meetings. Today, an eerie, suffocating silence hung heavily in the air. DeAndre looked toward the front reception desk. His lead secretary, a veteran administrative professional who never lost her composure, was standing rigid behind her mahogany counter. Her face was entirely drained of color. She was clutching a thick stack of manila folders and staring at DeAndre with absolute terror in her eyes. Before DeAndre could ask her what was wrong, 3 men stood up from the leather waiting chairs. They did not look like the wealthy corporate clients who typically patronized the firm. They wore cheap, off-the-rack gray suits and sensible rubber-soled shoes. They moved with a synchronized, predatory efficiency that immediately triggered every defense mechanism in DeAndre's highly trained, legal mind. The lead investigator, a tall man with a severe buzz cut and a completely emotionless face, walked directly toward DeAndre. The man did not extend his hand for a polite greeting. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and produced a black leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a shining silver badge bearing the seal of the federal government. "We are forensic auditors acting on behalf of the Securities and Exchange Commission," the lead investigator announced, his voice projecting clearly across the silent lobby. "We received an anonymous, heavily documented tip regarding severe irregularities in this firm's financial management. We are executing an immediate emergency audit of all corporate escrow holdings linked to your wealth management partners. You are hereby directed to surrender all administrative access to your digital servers and physical filing cabinets. Do not attempt to log into your workstation. Do not attempt to destroy any documents. You are officially under federal investigation." The words hit DeAndre with the devastating force of a heavy physical blow. His heart slammed against his ribs like a trapped animal. The mask of arrogant invincibility shattered completely, leaving only raw, paralyzing terror. The federal government was not supposed to be here. He had hidden the financial crimes behind layers of complex offshore holding companies and convoluted corporate structures. He thought he was untouchable. But the sudden, unannounced arrival of the Securities and Exchange Commission meant the paper trail connecting Naomi's stolen funds to the Cayman Islands Trust was completely exposed. Someone had spoon-fed the federal authorities the exact roadmap required to dismantle his lucrative legal career. DeAndre realized with sickening clarity that his arrogant maneuvering had become a massive, inescapable liability. The illegal commingling of stolen client funds was no longer a brilliant strategy to secure a bailout. It was a direct one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. He had authorized wire fraud. He had falsified official banking documents. He knowingly drained the life savings of vulnerable investors to artificially inflate Preston's liquidity. The federal auditors would trace the money flowing from Naomi's stolen business accounts directly into the fraudulent balance sheets submitted to Harrison Global. The evidence was absolute. He would be stripped of his law license, humiliated in front of the legal community, and disbarred permanently before the week was over. The lead investigator stepped closer, handing DeAndre a thick stack of legal warrants. "We need the encryption keys for the primary escrow accounts immediately," the investigator demanded, his tone laced with undisguised contempt. "Do not make this any more difficult than it already is. We currently have tactical teams waiting at your partner wealth management firm. We are locking down absolutely everything in this building." DeAndre felt his knees weaken. He was trapped, surrounded by federal agents in his own lobby. There was absolutely no way out of the building, and no legal loophole clever enough to save him from the undeniable proof of his crimes. He needed to warn Preston. The bailout meeting was a trap. Whoever sent the anonymous tip to the federal government had perfectly timed the execution to coincide with the Harrison Global signing ceremony. DeAndre desperately reached back into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking uncontrollably. He bypassed the security screen and hit Preston's speed dial. The line began to ring. 10 miles away, the oblivious vice president strode confidently through the pristine glass doors of Harrison Global headquarters. Preston ignored the buzzing phone in his pocket, assuming it was Camille complaining about her shopping trip. He flashed his most arrogant smile at the security desk, unaware that his entire world was collapsing behind him. Preston stepped smoothly into the private executive elevator leading to the highest floor. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing him inside the luxury cabin, the cell signal dropped entirely, leaving DeAndre's frantic warning undelivered. The elevator began its rapid ascent, carrying Preston directly into the execution chamber. The heavy steel doors sealed shut, trapping Preston in a silent ascent to the pinnacle of Harrison Global headquarters. He stood beside his father, Richard, who had boarded the adjacent private elevator from the underground garage just moments prior, meeting his son in the polished marble lobby of the 60th floor. The transition from the chaotic city streets to the hushed, fiercely controlled environment of the private equity titan was jarring. The architecture itself was designed to intimidate. Soaring ceilings composed of dark obsidian slate met floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a vertigo-inducing view of the financial district below. There were no warm colors, no comfortable waiting areas, and absolutely no artwork to distract the eye. Every single angle of the space communicated ruthless efficiency and unlimited wealth. Preston adjusted his silk tie, feeling a sudden strange drop in his stomach. He chalked it up to the rapid elevation change, but the sheer scale of the Harrison Global operation was beginning to weigh heavily on him. Standing in this fortress of shadow and glass, he realized they were nothing but a tiny, insignificant speck of dust. A woman in a sharp charcoal uniform approached them, moving silently across the polished floor. She did not smile or offer them a polite greeting or ask how their morning was going. She merely looked at them with cold, calculated professionalism and instructed them to follow her. Richard puffed out his chest, attempting to project his usual arrogant authority, but the receptionist did not even blink. She turned sharply and led them down a long, sterile corridor lined with frosted glass walls. They were ushered into a massive executive boardroom. The space was entirely enclosed in thick, soundproof glass, featuring a long table carved from a single slab of petrified wood. There were no chairs on their side of the table, only two sleek leather stools positioned directly across from a massive, high-backed executive chair. The unspoken power dynamic was incredibly clear. They were not here as equal partners. They were here as supplicants begging for a financial lifeline. The receptionist informed them the executive review committee would arrive shortly. She turned on her heel and exited the room, pulling the heavy glass door shut with a solid, definitive click. The complete silence of the room instantly swallowed them. Richard walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city with a tight, nervous smile. He clapped his hands together, rubbing his palms in eager anticipation. "We made it," Preston Richard said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, empty space. $150 million. This changes absolutely everything for our family legacy. The old guard might look down on our aggressive strategies, but once we secure this capital infusion, nobody will ever question our supremacy again. Preston nodded, taking a seat on one of the leather stools. He placed his expensive leather briefcase on the petrified wood table, but found he could not sit still. The oppressive silence of the room was beginning to gnaw at his nerves. He kept checking his expensive watch. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The promised executive review committee had not materialized. At the 30-minute mark, the pristine illusion of their impending victory began to fracture. Richard's cell phone buzzed violently inside his tailored jacket pocket. The sudden noise was deafening in the silent boardroom. Richard pulled the device out, frowning at the screen. He swiped to decline the call, but the phone immediately began vibrating again. He let out an irritated sigh and looked at the barrage of frantic text messages flooding his notification screen. It was Beatrice. She was sending dozens of messages in rapid succession. The preview text on the locked screen displayed chaotic, fragmented sentences demanding immediate attention. Richard caught glimpses of words like declined cards, humiliated, completely cut off, and fix this right now. Preston watched his father face contort with a mixture of confusion and intense irritation. "What is it?" Preston asked, shifting uncomfortably on his stool. "Is DeAndre trying to get through with a last-minute legal amendment?" Richard scowled, pressing the power button on his phone to silence the relentless buzzing entirely. "It is just your mother," Richard replied, shoving the phone back into his pocket with a dismissive gesture. "She is having some sort of dramatic meltdown at a boutique. Apparently there is a temporary fraud hold on the corporate accounts and she is throwing a tantrum because her black card was declined. It is incredibly bad timing, but it is nothing we need to worry about right now. DeAndre will handle the bank authorization. We cannot afford to be distracted." Preston felt a brief flash of unease, remembering the strange drop in cell service right before he entered the elevator. He wondered if DeAndre was actually handling the situation or if something else had triggered the sudden financial blockage. But he pushed the thought away, burying it under his towering ego. His father was right. A minor banking glitch was entirely irrelevant when they were moments away from securing a $150 million bailout. 45 minutes had now passed since they were escorted into the glass boardroom. Richard paced the length of the room, his expensive shoes clicking sharply against the dark slate floor. He checked his watch for the dozenth time. "They are making us sweat," Richard muttered. "It is a classic power play." Suddenly, the heavy double doors swung open. Purposeful footsteps echoed down the corridor. The thick glass door was pushed open by a guard. A team of 5 elite corporate lawyers filed inside, moving with predatory precision, carrying thick manila folders sealed with red federal security tape. They simply stared at Richard and Preston with clinical hostility. Then the final figure stepped through the heavy oak doors. A woman dressed in a sharp, dark, bespoke charcoal suit walked purposefully toward the massive, high-backed executive chair. Preston kept his head bowed. He was obsessively reviewing the final projections on his legal pad, refusing to let the intimidating atmosphere break his concentration. He needed this pitch to be absolutely flawless. He muttered under his breath, rehearsing the opening lines about market stability and generational wealth. Beside him, Richard let out a loud, arrogant scoff that echoed across the vast glass boardroom. Richard crossed his arms and glared at the woman approaching the head of the table. "What on earth are you doing here?" Richard demanded, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Did they seriously send my disgraced daughter-in-law to bring us coffee? If this is some kind of pathetic attempt to beg for your marriage back, you have chosen the worst possible moment. Get out of here before you ruin the most important meeting of our entire lives. We are not going to let you ruin this very important financial deal for us today or tomorrow." Preston finally stopped rehearsing his pitch, snapped his head up, irritated by the sudden disruption. The pen slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly against the petrified wood surface. Preston froze. All the air instantly vanished from his lungs. The woman standing before them was not holding a silver coffee tray. She was not crying or begging. She was flanked by a team of 5 elite corporate lawyers who treated her with absolute terrifying reverence. The dark purple bruise on her cheekbone was expertly concealed, but her eyes were entirely, completely unrecognizable. They were the eyes of a ruthless apex predator. Naomi did not offer Richard a single word of response. She did not even acknowledge his petty insult. She moved with a fluid, terrifying grace and took her seat directly in the massive, high-backed executive chair. The 5 corporate lawyers immediately took their positions, standing silently behind her like a royal guard. Naomi reached forward and placed her hands flat on the polished table. She looked at Preston and then at Richard. Her silence was a weapon, and she wielded it with devastating precision. Richard shifted uncomfortably on his leather stool. His arrogant posture began to crumble under the crushing weight of her silent stare. He opened his mouth to issue another command, but the words died in his throat. Naomi reached out and pulled the thick manila folder toward her. The folder was sealed with red federal security tape. She broke the seal with a sharp, decisive snap. She flipped open the heavy cover, revealing the exact $150 million bailout portfolio Preston and DeAndre had so desperately submitted to Harrison Global. "Let us begin the final liquidity audit," Naomi stated, her voice perfectly level and devoid of any human empathy. She did not look at them as she spoke. She looked only at the fraudulent numbers. "You claim a primary unencumbered capital pool of $40 million. You listed this as immediate cash on hand available for cross-collateralization against the commercial real estate development in the tech corridor." She turned the page, her movement slow and deliberate. "However, my forensic accounting team ran a complete routing analysis on these specific deposits over the past 48 hours. This liquidity is not unencumbered. It is not even yours. You engaged your corporate lawyer to execute a highly illegal commingling maneuver. You systematically drained the escrow accounts of your most vulnerable clients to artificially inflate your balance sheet." Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked at Preston with wide, terrified eyes. Preston was completely paralyzed. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The pristine illusion of their financial supremacy was being ripped apart by the very woman he had locked out in the freezing rain just hours ago. Naomi turned another page, highlighting a section of the document with a silver pen. "You then routed these stolen funds through a series of shell corporations before depositing them into an irrevocable offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands, a trust legally registered to your sister Camille. You attempted to use federally protected client money to secure a private equity bailout, committing wire fraud and severe securities violations in the process. You thought you could mask the deficit, but your architecture was fundamentally flawed." The sheer accuracy of her dismantling was breathtaking. She was reading their financial death sentence line by line, exposing every single criminal shortcut they had taken to keep their sinking empire afloat. Richard began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as the reality of federal prison materialized before his eyes. He realized the bank freeze Beatrice had panicked over was not a temporary glitch, it was an execution order. Preston reached his absolute breaking point. The crushing humiliation of being systematically destroyed by his discarded wife was too much for his fragile, towering ego to bear. The terror of impending federal charges morphed instantly into blind, desperate rage. He slammed his open hand down onto the petrified wood table with a deafening crack. The impact rattled the heavy glass walls of the boardroom. "Shut your mouth!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic and fury. "I do not know how you got into this building or who you slept with to get your hands on our private financial documents, but you are going to stop talking right now. You are a delusional, glorified construction worker. You have absolutely no authority here. Get out of this boardroom immediately before you ruin this deal and destroy our entire family." Naomi did not flinch at his outburst. She simply closed the heavy manila folder. She leaned forward, closing the physical distance between them across the massive mahogany table. She reached into the pocket of her bespoke charcoal suit and pulled out a single thick piece of premium cardstock. With a swift flick of her wrist, she slid the business card across the polished surface. It glided silently, stopping exactly an inch from Preston's trembling hands. Preston looked down at the thick premium cardstock resting on the petrified wood. His eyes locked onto the embossed silver lettering. He blinked once, trying to process the information. He blinked twice. His lips parted, but the air seemed to have completely vanished from the room. The text was impossible to misunderstand. It read, "Naomi Harrison, Executive Vice President and Majority Shareholder." The heavy silence in the glass boardroom stretched into an eternity. Preston dropped his gaze from the card to the woman sitting at the head of the table. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, translucent pallor. The arrogant snarl he wore just seconds ago completely melted away, replaced by a profound, paralyzing terror. He finally realized the magnitude of his catastrophic error. He had not just slapped his wife, he had struck the sole heir to the very empire he was currently begging for financial salvation. His entire world was collapsing right before his very eyes. Richard leaned over to look at the business card. His eyes scanned the silver text, and a violent shudder wrecked his entire body. He grabbed his chest, his breathing turning into shallow, rapid gasps. The older man began to hyperventilate the reality of their impending doom, crushing his lungs. The elite wealth management fund he spent decades building was completely at the mercy of the woman he had publicly humiliated. The night before, Richard slumped back onto his leather stool, gripping the edge of the table to keep from sliding onto the dark slate floor. He tried to speak to formulate an apology or a plea, but his throat was entirely paralyzed by shock. The walls were closing in on him. His legacy was dead and buried. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not yell or display a single ounce of the vindictive rage they expected from a discarded spouse. She spoke with a terrifying absolute calm that chilled the blood in their veins. "You thought you were so incredibly clever, Preston," she began, her voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. "You believed you could take my hard-earned money, the capital I built preserving historic foundations, and simply erase my claim to it. You allowed your corporate lawyer to funnel my savings into an offshore trust, bearing your sister's name. You looked me in the eye while taking my money to plug the holes in your sinking ship. And when I dared to speak the truth at your precious anniversary gala, you struck me and locked me out in the freezing rain. You treated me like absolute garbage." Preston began to tremble uncontrollably. His hands shook so violently they rattled against the table. Naomi leaned slightly forward, locking her dark eyes onto his panicked gaze. "But my money was not enough to save you," she continued, her tone clinical and devastating. "When my capital failed to cover your massive leverage, you turned to your own clients. You raided the pension funds of hardworking teachers. You drained the escrow accounts of elderly investors who trusted your family legacy with their life savings. You stole from vulnerable people to artificially inflate your balance sheet in a desperate bid to qualify for this exact bailout. You thought you could commit federal wire fraud and hide it behind aggressive legal posturing. You truly thought you were untouchable, masters of the financial universe. You thought completely wrong." Richard let out a pathetic whimpering sound, his face buried in his hands. Naomi shifted her gaze to her father-in-law, showing absolutely zero pity. "You stood at that podium, Richard, and mocked my lack of pedigree. You called me a charity case. You boasted about your superior bloodline while actively committing severe financial crimes to maintain the illusion of your wealth. You desperately wanted to enter the realm of true global power. Well, Richard, you have finally arrived. Welcome to Harrison Global. I hope you truly enjoy the view." Preston opened his mouth, a desperate plea forming on his lips. "Naomi, please." He choked out, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "We can fix this terrible error. I can explain the restructuring. It was all legal strategy, I swear to you. We can make you whole again. We can restore everything. We are still legally married. I truly love you. Naomi." Naomi smiled, a cold, empty expression that offered zero salvation. "There is no making me whole, Preston," she stated softly, "because there is nothing left of your firm to salvage. I am not here to negotiate a settlement. I am here to personally oversee your financial execution. Your entire legacy dies today." Before Preston could utter another pathetic excuse, the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom burst open with a violent crash. The sound shattered the tense atmosphere. DeAndre sprinted into the room, his usually immaculate appearance completely destroyed. The corporate lawyer was sweating profusely, his tailored suit jacket flying open and his tie hanging loose around his neck. He was clutching his encrypted smartphone, breathing heavily from a dead sprint. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He had run all the way from the lobby. "Preston, we are finished!" DeAndre shouted, his voice echoing with panic, completely ignoring the other people in the room. "The federal auditors are in the lobby right now. The Securities and Exchange Commission just froze every single asset we possess. They have the offshore routing numbers. They know all about the Cayman Islands Trust. We are facing federal indictments by noon. We need to surrender immediately." DeAndre took 2 more steps toward the table and suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His frantic eyes finally registered the imposing woman sitting confidently in the massive, high-backed executive chair at the head of the mahogany table. The breath caught in his throat as the absolute realization struck him. He knew exactly what this meant. He realized he had walked directly into a perfectly orchestrated trap and was ruined. DeAndre stood frozen in the doorway, his chest heaving as he stared at the woman he had evicted just 48 hours ago. The sheer magnitude of his miscalculation crashed down upon him, crushing the brilliant legal mind he had always weaponized against others. He looked at Richard hyperventilating on his stool, and then at Preston, who was completely paralyzed with fear. The trap had snapped shut, and there was absolutely no escape from the glass boardroom. Naomi did not offer DeAndre a greeting. She simply shifted her gaze back to her father-in-law, Richard. The older man was struggling to draw breath, his hands clutching his chest as he watched his empire evaporate. Naomi picked up the bailout application and held it suspended over the petrified wood table. "Richard, your request for a $150 million capital injection is officially and permanently denied," Naomi stated, her voice ringing with finality. "Because your firm is massively overleveraged and entirely dependent on this specific influx of cash, you will breach your loan covenants within the hour. Your creditors have already been notified of our decision by my executive staff. You will be forced to declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy before 5 o'clock this evening. The legacy you spent your entire life building, the very same legacy you used to justify my public humiliation, is completely dead. You are financially ruined, and your name will be synonymous with catastrophic failure in this city for the next century." Richard let out a strangled gasp. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cold, polished table, defeated and destroyed. Naomi then turned her dark, piercing eyes toward the doorway where DeAndre remained planted. Her gaze was clinical, stripping away his expensive suit and his arrogant demeanor until nothing remained but a terrified criminal. "DeAndre, you thought you were the smartest man in any room you walked into," Naomi said. "You orchestrated the theft of my personal savings, and you built a fraudulent offshore trust to hide your extensive crimes. You threatened to bury me in endless litigation, assuming I was a helpless victim who lacked the resources to fight." DeAndre took a hesitant step forward, his expensive leather shoes feeling like lead weights. His throat was completely dry. Naomi reached to her right and picked up a thick file. She slid it forcefully across the massive mahogany table, stopping precisely at the edge, right in front of DeAndre. He looked down at the label, recognizing the internal routing codes for his own law firm. "Open it," Naomi commanded. DeAndre reached out with a trembling hand and flipped open the cover. Inside lay the undeniable proof of his wire fraud bank transfers, unauthorized client withdrawals, and the exact digital signatures connecting him to the Cayman Islands accounts. The evidence was absolute and entirely damning. "You told me I did not have the money for a lawyer," DeAndre, Naomi said, leaning back in her high-backed executive chair. "You were right. I did not need one. I bought your firm's parent company this morning. You are fired, and you will be disbarred." DeAndre gasped, gripping the edge of the table to steady his shaking frame. The reality of her words meant his career was instantly obliterated. He was no longer a partner at a prestigious firm. He was an unemployed federal suspect facing decades in prison. "The forensic auditors currently raiding your lobby were personally dispatched by my acquisitions team," Naomi continued relentlessly. "They have the encryption keys, and they are seizing every single asset you thought you cleverly hid." By the time you take the elevator down to the ground floor, federal agents will be waiting to place you in handcuffs. Your wife Camille is currently experiencing the decline of her platinum credit cards across the city. I have also initiated the immediate foreclosure on the luxury estate you both reside in because it was listed as collateral in your fraudulent loan applications. You are going to federal prison. DeAndre and your wife is going to be sleeping on the street. DeAndre collapsed onto the leather stool, his face buried in his hands, shaking uncontrollably as the weight of his total destruction settled over him. The boardroom descended into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the two ruined men. Naomi turned her full attention to the man across from her. Preston had watched his father and his brother-in-law get systematically dismantled in a matter of minutes. The arrogant wealth manager who had slapped her across the face and thrown her into the freezing rain was now stripped of his money, his status, and his false superiority. Preston looked at Naomi, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic panic. He realized that he was the last target remaining on her list. The sheer terror of losing everything broke the fragile remnants of his towering ego. He could not maintain the facade of a powerful executive for another second. Preston pushed himself off the leather stool, his legs trembling so violently they could barely support his weight. He did not yell or demand respect. He took 2 unsteady steps toward the head of the table and then completely collapsed. He fell onto his knees, hitting the dark slate floor with a loud thud. He crawled forward until he was positioned directly at Naomi's feet, his suit wrinkling against the cold stone. "Naomi, please," Preston begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. Tears streamed down his face. "I will change. I promise I will leave the other woman. I will end the affair today. I swear it." "It was not my fault," Preston sobbed, shifting the blame with pathetic eagerness. "It was my father. He forced me to take the aggressive positions. And DeAndre orchestrated the fraud. They manipulated me, Naomi. You have to spare me. Please, Naomi. I am begging you on my hands and knees." Preston remained on the dark slate floor. His expensive suit was ruined by the awkward way he crawled toward the massive table. Tears streamed down his face. He clasped his hands together in a desperate, pleading gesture. He looked nothing like the arrogant wealth manager who had paraded through the country club gala 48 hours ago. His face was blotchy and red. Saliva pooled at the corners of his mouth as he babbled incoherent apologies. He offered to sell his cars to pay me back. He offered to publicly apologize to my colleagues. He even offered to testify against his father and brother-in-law in federal court if I granted him mercy. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed executive chair. I looked down at the man I had called my husband for a decade. I felt zero pity. The 5 elite corporate lawyers standing behind me remained completely silent. They watched the pathetic display with cold professional detachment. Richard was slumped over the table, gasping for air as his financial empire evaporated. DeAndre remained frozen in the doorway, utterly paralyzed by his impending disbarment and federal indictment. The entire glass boardroom felt completely suffocating. I placed my hands flat on the polished, petrified wood surface. I pushed my chair back slowly. The scrape of the chair legs against the slate floor echoed loudly in the quiet room. I stood up to my full height. I smoothed the front of my bespoke charcoal suit. I stepped away from the head of the table and began walking toward Preston. The sharp click of my heels against the stone floor sounded like a metronome counting down the final seconds of his privileged life. The entire room held its breath. Richard stopped gasping and looked up with wide, terrified eyes. DeAndre swallowed hard, gripping the doorframe. Preston stopped his pathetic babbling. He looked up at me from his knees, trembling like a cornered animal. He braced himself, shutting his eyes tightly. He genuinely expected physical violence. He expected me to strike him across the face in front of his ruined family and my team of lawyers. He expected me to exact physical revenge for the brutal assault I suffered at his hands. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of him. I looked down at his cowering form. I did not raise my hand once. I did not clench my fists. I spoke with a terrifying, gentle softness that cut deeper than any shouted threat could ever manage. I told myself I would make you pay for that slap. My voice was smooth and perfectly controlled. I spent the last 48 hours imagining the exact moment I would return the favor. I thought about how satisfying it would feel to strike you down and watch you bleed on this pristine floor, just like you made me bleed on the marble floor of the country club. Preston kept his eyes squeezed shut, a fresh wave of tears leaking from the corners. He let out a pathetic whimper. But hitting you back would make me like you. I continued my tone devoid of any human warmth. Striking a defenseless, pathetic creature is a complete coward's tactic. It is the action of a weak, small man who desperately needs to prove his dominance because he possesses absolutely no real power. I am not a coward, Preston, and I am certainly not weak. Therefore, I will not lay a single finger on you today. Instead, I am taking the only thing ever making you feel like a man. I turned my back on him and walked to the mahogany table. I picked up a thin black folder my lead attorney had prepared this morning. I walked back and tossed the folder onto the floor directly in front of Preston's trembling knees. The folder slid open, revealing a crisp, legal document bearing the official seal of the state court. "That is your revised divorce decree," I stated, looking down at his panicked face. DeAndre was very kind to file the initial paperwork in absentia yesterday afternoon. It saved my legal team a significant amount of administrative time. However, we made a few mandatory adjustments to the asset division clauses. You see, Preston, you are not getting the $5,000 relocation fee you so generously offered me. In fact, you are not getting anything at all. Preston opened his eyes and stared at the legal document resting on the dark slate floor. He reached out with a shaking hand and pulled the pages toward his face. His eyes darted rapidly across the dense legal text, trying to comprehend the absolute financial annihilation outlined in the paragraphs. He gasped for air reading the permanent financial consequences of his devastating actions. "I stripped you of the marital home. The historic estate is my sole property. I stripped you of your vehicle collection. My team has taken physical possession of the cars. You are absorbing 100% of the massive toxic debt generated by your fraudulent real estate investments. You signed the primary loan documents using forged liquidity metrics, making you personally liable for the outstanding balances. I am leaving you with nothing but the clothes on your back and massive federal debt." Preston dropped the decree, letting out a wail of agony. He grabbed his hair, realizing he was entering a lifetime of inescapable, crippling poverty. His identity was obliterated. The heavy oak doors swung open with a crash, silencing his wailing instantly. Harrison entered the boardroom. My father wore a tailored blue suit radiating terrifying authority. He was flanked by 4 security contractors blocking the exit. Harrison walked past trembling DeAndre and hyperventilating Richard. He stopped beside me, looking down at Preston weeping on the floor. My father viewed him with absolute disgust. The powerful billionaire did not raise his voice. He simply turned his head toward the lead security contractor. "Remove these trespassers from my building," Harrison commanded. The 4 highly trained security contractors moved with fluid, uncompromising efficiency. They did not shout or brandish weapons. Their mere presence was enough to enforce absolute compliance. 2 of the men stepped forward and grasped Preston by his upper arms, hauling him off the dark slate floor. His legs gave out completely, unable to support his own weight. He hung suspended between the 2 large men, his expensive suit dragging against the polished stone as they hauled him toward the heavy oak doors. He continued to sob, a pathetic, high-pitched wail echoing through the glass boardroom. Richard did not require physical force. He stood up on shaky legs, his face completely drained of color. He looked broken, a hollow shell of the arrogant patriarch who had commanded the country club gala just 48 hours ago. He cast one final terrified glance at Harrison before shuffling out the door, flanked by the remaining security personnel. DeAndre, the brilliant corporate lawyer who had orchestrated the massive federal fraud, was the last to leave. He walked out with his head bowed, his career, his marriage, and his entire future completely obliterated. The heavy oak doors swung shut with a resounding thud, plunging the boardroom back into pristine silence. The 5 corporate lawyers gathered their files and exited quietly, leaving my father and me alone in the vast glass enclosure. Harrison walked over to the windows looking out over the city skyline. He turned to face me, a rare, genuine smile softening his typically harsh features. "You executed that flawlessly, Naomi," he said, his voice a low, proud rumble. "You did not just survive their attack. You completely dismantled their entire foundation. You proved exactly who you are." I looked down at the revised divorce decree resting on the petrified wood table. The signature line remained blank, waiting for Preston's inevitable compliance. I did not feel a rush of vindictive joy. I felt a profound sense of closure. The 10-year experiment was officially over, and the true work of building my legacy was just beginning. 6 months later, the city air was crisp and bright, reflecting the vibrant energy of early autumn. I stood on the wide stone steps of a stunning Victorian mansion located in the heart of the historic district. The structure had been abandoned for over 2 decades, left to rot by developers who deemed it too expensive to salvage. I had personally overseen the meticulous restoration project, funding the entire endeavor through my own private trust. The mansion was no longer a decaying relic. It was a fully operational, state-of-the-art, transitional shelter for women escaping domestic and financial abuse. I wore a tailored emerald green suit, my hair pulled back in a sleek chignon. The dark purple bruise from the country club gala was a distant memory entirely erased by time and healing. I looked out over the crowd gathered on the manicured lawn. The local press, city officials, and dozens of community leaders were in attendance. They were here to celebrate the opening of the shelter and to acknowledge the substantial philanthropic contribution I had made. I was not hiding in the shadows anymore. I was standing firmly in the light. The contrast between my current reality and the catastrophic downfall of my former family was staggering. The financial execution I had orchestrated in the glass boardroom had proceeded with terrifying precision. DeAndre's arrogant legal maneuvering had resulted in his swift and permanent disbarment. He was currently awaiting federal trial for multiple counts of wire fraud and securities violations. To cover his mounting legal fees, he had taken a job as a low-level paralegal at a discount law firm forced to fetch coffee for attorneys he once considered vastly inferior. Camille and Beatrice, the self-proclaimed queens of the elite social circle, had experienced an incredibly harsh reality check. Their luxury estates were seized by the bank. Their exclusive country club memberships were revoked. They were currently residing in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Without access to the stolen client funds, they were forced to systematically liquidate their designer wardrobes. Beatrice was frequently seen at high-end consignment shops, aggressively haggling over the resale value of the vintage silk scarves and diamond-encrusted accessories she had purchased on the morning of their financial ruin. Preston suffered the most spectacular collapse. Stripped of his home, his cars, and his lucrative career, he was saddled with the massive toxic debt from his fraudulent real estate investments. The elite social circle he so desperately worshipped had completely exiled him. He was blacklisted from every financial institution in the state. The last I heard, he was working a minimum-wage retail job at a suburban home improvement store, wearing a bright orange vest and stocking shelves in the plumbing aisle. His carefully constructed image of power and superiority was entirely annihilated. I stood on the stone steps of the newly restored shelter, holding a pair of oversized golden scissors. The mayor concluded his introductory remarks and gestured toward me. The crowd erupted in enthusiastic applause. I smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that felt completely natural. I felt my phone buzz in the pocket of my emerald suit. I pulled the device out and glanced at the screen. It was a text message from Harrison. The message read simply, "The foundation is solid. I am very proud of you. I read the words twice, feeling a deep, profound warmth spread through my chest. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked out at the supportive crowd, the flashing cameras, and the beautiful historic building I had saved from destruction. I was no longer a victim seeking validation from toxic parasites. I was no longer hiding my true potential to appease a fragile man's ego. I stepped forward, gripping the golden scissors firmly. I was Naomi Harrison, and I was the absolute architect of my own empire. The story of Naomi's rise from a humiliated, diminished wife to a commanding architect of her own empire illuminates a profound lesson: never shrink yourself to fit into a space that was never meant to hold your true potential. For a decade, Naomi hid her incredible wealth, intellect, and lineage, hoping to be loved for her character rather than her status. Yet by diminishing her light to comfort her husband's fragile ego, she inadvertently allowed toxic people to exploit her perceived vulnerabilities. She learned the hard way that shrinking yourself does not buy genuine love or respect. It only invites exploitation from those who prey on the weak. True empowerment begins the moment we stop accepting the false narratives that manipulators project onto us. When Naomi was publicly humiliated, slapped, and financially stripped by Preston and his arrogant family, she did not respond with chaotic vengeance or desperate pleas. Instead, she reclaimed the identity she had buried. She weaponized her quiet observation, her resilience, and her sharp intellect. Her ultimate victory was not merely dismantling her in-laws' fraudulent financial empire, but stepping back into her own authentic power. She proved that our value is not determined by those who fail to see it, but by our own willingness to stand firmly in our truth. We often compromise our boundaries to keep the peace, hoping our sacrifices will be met with mutual loyalty. Naomi's journey reminds us that authentic relationships are built on mutual respect, not subjugation. When we strip away the masks we wear to appease others, we finally discover the unshakable foundation of our own self-worth. Take a moment today to evaluate the relationships in your life and boldly step away from any table where your true worth is not being respected.